How often is it you make a mistake and you're just like, all right, we're good. I'm just gonna like pretend that never happened. When you own your mistakes, it's not comfortable, but it actually shows how to truly lead. Right.
Mhm.
Coming back to exactly like you said, credibility, trust. We cannot build actual credibility if we are unwilling to admit when we screw up.
Leaders are not born in a womb. They are forged through heat, pressure, and a whole lot of sweat. The Fire Forged Leader podcast serves the audience through exploring leadership at work, in the community, and with the family, using a practical perspective and real-life experiences from the host, Steve Baumgartner, and his guests in the Forge. Now, it's time to enter the Forge with the Fire Forged Leader.
Welcome back to Fire Forged Leader. This is Dan and Brad, your hosts of the Masculine Leadership Series, and we're here today to kick off our new set of podcasts that involve all things masculinity and leadership. So, how you doing today, Brad?
Pretty good, man. I have sequestered myself in a podcasting room in my office, so these are new digs for me, but so far so good. How are you doing?
Pretty cool, man. That looks almost professional.
Something like that.
No, I'm doing pretty good. It's been it's an interesting time of year for me. It's very busy with school, with the kids, and hunting season and all that stuff. But it's been good. So
Nice.
So as I mentioned, we want to jump into a new series that we're starting here. The first set of podcasts that we're going to do center around the idea of the foundations of authentic masculinity and leadership. Right. So Steve brought us on to take the concepts of masculinity and leadership and kind of meld them together. And that's what we want to do. We want to start that process by talking about the foundations. And the first episode we want to do is where we redefine what masculine leadership in the modern world looks like. I figured that was a nice place to start, get our feet on the ground here and get the guys running in the right direction. So the idea here is that we want to talk about the key takeaways of empathy, strength, and integrity in leadership, and then kind of talk about how all those things go together and what makes good masculine leadership in the modern world. So we'll jump in there. I think it's probably good to start with a little historical context of masculine leadership. So, Brad, if I was to ask you historically, what does the model of leadership look like? What would you say?
If you think of traditional old school leadership, you're often going to find yourself thinking about power dynamics, right?
Mhm.
Control, like autocracy. I don't know if autocracy is a word, but autocratic leadership. Like essentially what I say goes. I am the boss. You do what I say. You follow my commands. Ultimately, that's kind of been, if you think back throughout history, if you think back to millennia ago, all the way up through even the early 1900s, you think of like a Henry Ford, you think of that kind of leadership. You could almost argue as if it were being with an iron fist.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was thinking very much about the that TV series Mad Men, and how the leadership in that show was just very autocratic and very kind of you will do what I say kind of mentality, and it flowed from the top down without very much input from the bottom up.
Yeah.
So, would you say that those leadership styles were effective?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to understand societally. Okay, I know I was very quick to say absolutely, but you could argue that there were some effective ways in which folks were able to lead that way. Somebody needed to make a decision in that environment. It was the boss is in charge of making the decision no matter what. And was that always the right decision? Obviously not. I think of countless examples throughout history where that was not the case. But if you were to suggest that a leadership style of that manner would be more effective than not taking leadership, sure. Now we have a little bit of hindsight to our advantage that we can understand that, what was considered an effective leadership style may not necessarily be so. Just because we live in a different world than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we have to understand that leadership has evolved, but I would argue that for its time and for its place, it served its purpose, but we've kind of evolved. as humans are wont to do. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I would add in too that I think even today in certain situations, there are areas of leadership where that works. If you're in if you're in the military and you're in live action, right? The autocratic do as I say mentality without any kind of upward information flow or upward input. I guess information flow and input are two different things. Is very valuable, right? Because you have to make decisions right then, right there. Even we just had the hurricanes ripped through North Carolina, right? And in some of those rescue situations, people need to be making decisions on the spot instantaneously because people's lives were in danger. In those situations, that type of leadership is effective. But I would say that, as you mentioned, we've evolved and kind of society has changed a little bit. The idea of full autocratic rule probably is not as powerful as the idea of melding in some levels of collaboration and influence and trust. I know trust is a big thing with you in leadership. Those three things in today's world, in my opinion, get you a lot further in leadership. At the end of the day, if you're the leader, you're still the one left in charge and responsible for the decision making. That doesn't mean you have to rule with that iron fist that was so prevalent, years ago.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting dynamic in which things that would have seemed almost not masculine, if you will, like this idea of collaboration, this idea of trust. If you were to ask somebody 50 years ago, are those leadership styles or things that you would, impose on your folks, and quickly the answer would be no. But like you said, many years ago, you're thinking even pre-industrial revolution through the industrial revolution, like you're farming, you have to harvest. Of course, somebody's got to make a decision. You're in a military, even within the concept of parenting, right? It's very easy, and there's a very clear line of delineation between how I parent and lead within the confines of my home and how I lead other individuals. And it's very easy to get those transposed, but it's
Mhm.
really, really important to understand that because we have evolved a little bit, we have to be willing to refine or redefine how we view masculine leadership today in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you spoke about redefining masculine leadership. I think there's a couple of core elements that go along with that, right? Strength, I think, is still a very important part of masculine leadership. Integrity. I mean, I've never seen the term integrity and masculinity not associated to each other, at least when masculinity is talked about in a positive way. And then the idea of empathy, which to me is always a weird word in that it can sound very, for lack of a better term, wokish, but it does have its place in terms of successful leadership. So maybe we can jump into those a little bit here. Let's start with the tough one, empathy. How do you view that as being a strength in leadership? Or do you?
Empathy is actually one of the key elements that I look at when it comes to leadership, right? Like one of the examples I think of often is right now at the day job, I am dealing with quarterly commissions payouts. And the way that my company handles it, much like anything with any sales function, it's here are your projected commissions based on, what we've calculated, based on renewals, based on expansions, based on folks who've churned, and it produces a number. And one of the folks on my team, within the confines of my team, they are technical success managers, meaning that they are responsible in a customer facing role for the technical success of a customer. In our structure, they also have an account manager who's primarily responsible for expansion, managing the commercial implications, etc. We had to let go of an account manager that this TSM was working with, and it adversely impacted this person's ability to close any expansions throughout the quarter. And coming to me, this individual saying, "Man, Brad, it's gonna be a really rough quarter for me because I didn't have any opportunities for expansion." And empathy is understanding, okay, I see where you're coming from. I can understand and meet you at your level. And what that does is understanding one, right? Like I care about this person on a foundational level. and we'll get back to this, like that kind of ties into my concept of trust. But when they know that they can, oh, my boss sees me and sees and understands what I'm going through, that allows me to lead them effectively and say, unfortunately, you were dealt a bad hand. Like that's something that's really unfortunate. But if you look at all the other areas in which you've lined up your work, you're setting yourself up for an incredible Q4. So what that did is that turned a conversation where this person was pretty upset that their commission check was going to be docked by about 50% into okay, this situation still sucks, right? There's nothing that took away from that. But my boss is here helping me, understanding the situation, is going to help me execute on these things that are outstanding in Q4 so that I can make up for what was a lackluster Q3. So the ability to empathize with somebody and meet them at their level and understand what they're going through can actually help you lead effectively in that, knowing what they're going through, knowing what they're struggling with. It just creates an environment in which they know that their boss has their back.
Mm-hmm. We're talking a lot about leadership in the career aspect too, but empathy for me really jumps out in the home front, especially fatherhood, which is, I'm sure, a topic that we'll dig deeper into in later episodes. But in general, empathy as a father, especially, I think, with men who have daughters. I've got 2 teenage daughters at this point, and I have to have empathy in order to have a good relationship with my girls, right? I have to be able to kind of, to use your words, meet them on their level and be able to try to understand where they're coming from. Otherwise, I get a very emotional response from them when I try to lead and direct them. It's very easy, quote unquote, to come down and say, do this because I said so.
Yeah.
But when you're a parent, sometimes it's not just because I said so. There's lessons to be learned. And there's also, I have to put myself in their shoes sometimes to try and understand why they made certain decisions they did and be able to empathize with what they're going through and what the situations they're in that either I've never been in or it's been 30 plus years since I've been in it. And, be able to have a little understanding as to their position and their decision making. That doesn't mean I don't need to be strong and I don't need to have integrity, to go back to the 2 other points that we're going to talk about here in a minute, with my parenting. But being empathetic to their situation allows me to better understand. And while I may have to punish and or correct them, I still help. It helps to maintain that relationship. So I think empathy, to me, is the biggest tool in leadership used to maintain relationships as you lead.
So I kind of have a question for you along those lines, right? You talked about empathy and the need to still be able to discipline your kids.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find that balance, right? Like obviously disciplining a child is important, but how does empathy factor into the way in which you discipline your kids?
Well, if I had the full answer to that, I'd write a book and make millions of dollars. But
What do you
in my experience, let's just put cards on the table. Historically, I have been the dad who just kind of blows up, right? Like things reach a certain boiling point and I get upset and it's just a bunch of yelling and screaming and this is what it'll be. The last 5 or 6 years, I've really been working on that and kind of toned it down. And I've learned that one of the ways to do it is to take a step back and first try to understand why the kids did what they did. And that's the biggest piece of empathy for me is trying to put myself in their shoes and understand them. And that allows me to perhaps not have the I'm going to use the word visceral reaction that I do to some of the things that they do. It allows me to calm down and be able to talk to them on their level and understand at least what maybe was going through their mind when they made one of their invariably stupid decisions, which I'm sure you and I both made when we were kids as well.
Yeah, man.
Right. But that empathy allows me to break down the barrier a little bit between parent and child, while still maintaining the structure of leadership.
No, that's a really good point. And I think one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about that is we want to get mad at our kids because, we're sitting here in our 40s feeling like we've got most everything in our lives figured out, and you're
We
dealing
can
with
armchair
teenagers.
quarterback it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the armchair quarterback. And like, oh, I've lived this. I know how I was able to get through that.
Right.
Why can't they figure it out? You
Right.
have to realize you've got teenagers. I've got a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. They're going through many of these things for the first time. They don't really know how to react or how to respond or how to
hmm
appropriately manage peer pressure, right?
hmm
So when they're making these dumb decisions, our tendency is to want to just grab them and shake them and be like, what are you doing? You're an idiot.
Yeah.
But I had this really profound experience. I was just sitting in church yesterday, right? And we try to send our kids to church with like little activities to keep them busy so they can stay quiet and everything. And I just sat and I looked at my kids, and all I could see is just how inherently good they are. Like that these are just incredible children of God who don't have everything figured out. They're going to make mistakes. They've already
Yep.
made plenty of mistakes. Right? Like my son snuck in and like ate my daughter's entire candy stash the other day. Um, they're just inherently good, right? Like they're my little clones and my little minions. And God sent them to me to be able to lead them and teach them and show them and help them become better than I was or will ever be.
hmm
And that allowed me to just see them empathetically through eyes of love. And obviously this is much more of a family thing. Like you shouldn't look at your subordinates at work or your coworkers and look at them through like this lens. But when you can really see your kids, for example, or your wife for who they truly are authentically, it makes empathy that much easier, right? Because you're understanding they're just doing their best with what they have, right? You didn't marry
Yeah.
a psychopath. Your kids are not little hellions who are going to end up in prison. They are good, incredible human beings. And understanding that makes it a lot easier to be able to lead with empathy.
Yeah. You said that you shouldn't look at your employees like that. And I agree. But at the same time, you can look at them as a person and not just a tool to get work done. Right. And you can understand that there's a human being there and they're going through stuff. As much as we say you shouldn't bring it to the office, a lot of times people bring it to the office. And having a little bit of empathy for stuff that you may not even know is going on at home. They may have a sick mother, or they may be going through a breakup, or the dog died, or whatever it is, and they're not talking about it necessarily. But it may be affecting how they're doing work. And to have a little bit of empathy and not immediately just jump on them is an important part of leadership. So I want to move on a little bit though to the idea of strength. Because I think that they counterbalance strength and empathy counterbalance each other fairly well in this scenario. So can you speak a little bit about how you see strength as kind of a key principle of masculine leadership?
Yeah. I mean, you think of the very concept of strength, and the first thing that kind of comes to your mind tends to be resilience, the ability to stand up whenever things are difficult. And within a workplace, at home, and in your community, right? We think of Hurricane Helene, for example, that just
hmm
happened. How much strength was exhibited by individuals, by first responders, by whomever, right? The ability to be strong means that you're consistently standing up regardless of the environment. You might have woken up on the wrong side of the bed and you're having a really bad day personally. You could be dealing with a really terrible situation at work where a customer's escalated or a deadline needs to be met and you know that there's no chance to be able to meet that, right? So in that, when these storms come, most people don't necessarily know how to weather those storms and how to handle them. Like that adversity feels like they just got kicked in the shins or worse.
hmm
And when that happens, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a deadline you're not going to hit, whether it's your daughter had a horrible softball game, went over 4, struck out 4 times. Like those are all things that are going to feel like adversity. They're going to feel like struggle. Strength is the idea to let them know that when things get hard, they can look to you for that consistency, for that balance, that you're going to be able to stand up and weather that storm, whatever it is, and help them know that it's going to be okay.
hmm I agree with a lot of that. And the other thing that I'll add is, we talked a little bit about the concept of like the autocratic leader previously. Just the this is coming down from above, kind of you shall do as I say type of leadership. I do think that is where strength comes in. Because as I mentioned before, there are those situations where a leader needs to stand up and just take charge. And to be a strong leader, you need to be capable of doing that, but not necessarily rely on doing that. So Hurricane Helene, right? Like we already mentioned a couple times now, there were guys who stood up and just took charge and said, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. You're going to do this. I need you to do that. And it made the difference in a lot of situations. But you also need to be able to stand up in a meeting at work. And if things are just going round robin, be like, okay, I'm making an executive decision. We're going to go this way, take this option. I need so-and-so to do this, so-and-so to do that. Let's roll out. But that should not be the standard, right? That needs to be, you need to have that capability to stand up and lead and be the decision maker. But the constant use of it is not the good trait of a leader. Does that make a lot of sense?
Yeah, you're speaking a little bit toward kind of the autocratic. We need to make a decision. We need to push forward.
Right.
That is strength contains elements of the ability to make a decision. Right, indecision is something that cripples a lot of folks due to fear, due to whatever emotion has kind of run the day. That ability to be autocratic and say, "Okay, let's go," is a core element of strength. But I would argue it's not necessarily all of it. Right, like
No.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if it came off that way, I didn't intend it that way. What I was getting at was it's an element of strength in leadership, right? You need to be able to do it. But I think that a strong leader actually is one who can take feedback, take input, use a collaborative method. And when the collaborative method isn't working, they're able to stand up and make a decision and have the backbone to be confident in what they're going to do going forward.
Yeah. There you go. Okay. I gotcha. Yeah. I mean, obviously strength is, I need a decision. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Like, Dan, I don't know how often you deal with this. I mean, obviously we deal with it at work, but I mean at home, but you think at work, how often somebody comes to you and be like, I don't know what to do right now. What do we do?
Yeah.
And to be an effective leader, you have to be able to say in that situation, even if you don't necessarily have the answer, say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Let's go. The ability to make a decision and to understand what the temperature of the situation is, how to effectively communicate that. And even if you don't necessarily have all the answers, understanding, I know what to do to get those answers. I'm decisive. Like, it's just that ability of being decisive. Like that level of strength is something that you think of, not just in autocratic situations, but just across the gamut.
So it's interesting because that idea of the ability to stand up and make the decision, having people follow you when you make those decisions plays right into the third principle of integrity. Because if you don't have integrity, if you don't have, the ability to always kind of be a man of your word, people are not going to follow those decisions, whether you're willing to stand up and make them or not. So when we talk about kind of the three pillars here, empathy, strength, and integrity, my opinion is that while empathy and strength are two kind of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of leadership styles, integrity is the bridge between the two. And it really kind of allows the leader to have his followers trust him, because they know that those decisions that are being made from we'll call it the strength side, are being made with the best intentions. And there's an integrity that's involved that is inclusive of feedback that he's gotten, but also realizing that there's final goals that need to be met.
Yeah. I mean, the very concept of integrity is, I like how you use the term of bridging it, right? Like, we're bringing everything together. Integrity is, in my opinion, there's so much consistency involved in being in integrity with yourself. You say X, so you need to make sure that you execute on that, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
If you promise your kids that you are going to, I don't know, show up at their school event. You're going to make sure that you do that.
Hmm.
If you tell your folks at work that you are going to execute on something that you promised them that you would, or you're going to follow up, you absolutely have to. In leadership, if you drop the ball in any of those capacities, if you are not aligned, if your words are not aligned with your actions, and that integrity is compromised, all of your credibility is lost. You can say all these wonderful things, but if you don't actually put things into action, they're going to fall deaf. They're going to fall on deaf ears. And ultimately, at the end of the day, once that trust is gone at home, at work, it's really hard to get it back.
It's really hard to get it back.
And I can
And the
think
flip
of
side to that is also that having integrity is one of the quickest ways to build trust. If you say what you're going to do and you do what you say, people will very quickly realize, okay, this is a guy who there's no bullshit. He's going to do, what he says. His word is his bond, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And they can trust you in that what you say is going to get done is going to get done, or what you're going to do is what you say you're going to do is what you're going to do.
Hey, here's a question for you, Dan. Have you had any examples in your life where you've been out of integrity or you've kind of failed in the integrity department and you've had to try to rebuild that trust professionally, whether that's personally? Obviously, I know that the answer to that's yes, but is there something
Yeah.
you'd be willing to share? Kind of an example of it.
I'm just trying. I mean, I know there has been. I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head. I've had situations with my kids where I'll just yes them to death to get them off my back. Whether it's, hey, can we go get an ice cream after work? Can we go do this? Can we go do that? Or yeah. And then I'll forget about it, or I'll whatever. And 2 months later, they'll call me on it and be like, remember that time you said you were going to take me to go get ice cream and you didn't? Like, that to me, first of all, it's a gut punch when your kids say that to you. But that to me is one of the biggest examples of being out of integrity. I'm sure I've had stuff at work where I've made commitments and I haven't followed through on them. I can't think of any off the top of my head now that you put me on the spot. But I've definitely had situations like that with my wife too, where even little stuff like, yeah, I'll take out the trash today, and the trash is still there in the morning. It's little things, but it doesn't matter big or little. It's the accumulation of how many times are you out of integrity that builds or breaks trust with people.
Yeah, it's really well put. I can think of countless examples of the same thing. I told my wife I'd take the trash out. I told my son I'd take him fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And then life got in the way. And then I just blamed it on being busy, right? Oh, I got busy and I forgot. No, I wasn't busy. I chose to not follow through on a commitment that I had made.
Mm-hmm.
That's on me. Nobody else.
Yep. Yeah, it's a tough one. So I think as we move on here a little bit, right? The idea of so we've kind of talked about these pillars or these ideas of what is leadership, right? So I want to move a little bit more into a strategic side, right? Like, how do you shape your leadership philosophy? So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that to begin with?
I mean, it's when you're trying to build a philosophy in terms of how you want to lead, it just has to boil down to, it comes back to integrity, like understanding who you are, understanding what your core values are, what your beliefs are, what do you know about yourself, what do you know about others, and how do you want those things to, reflect in your interactions with others. If you find yourself to be let's just say, a strong person, right? How am I going to make sure that strength shows up in my interactions with other folks? How am I going to make sure that when I lead, I do so with strength, that I can be decisive, that I can be somebody that can be reliable, dependable, that when things get crazy, people know that they can come to me. If that's a core belief within my heart, I have to make sure that I am in integrity, if you will, with that belief by exhibiting those characteristics when I'm put in those positions.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I think that for the listeners, right, they need to take a look at the three things that we mentioned, right? Strength, empathy, and integrity. and spend some time kind of marinating on what those mean to them. What do those mean to them? What do they mean in a leadership style to them? And one of the best ways I found to do this is envision a leader who you've respected in the past that you've either worked for or worked under, in work, community, church, whatever. How did they incorporate kind of those three things, and what made them such a great leader? And if you kind of take that and you kind of start thinking about it, then you can start to kind of create your own leadership philosophy and derive those skills into how you're going to implement them in your life.
Yeah. And once you've kind of derived these ways of understanding, okay, this is what I need to do, right? The next step is to actually go out and execute.
Mm-hmm.
Like it can feel intimidating, right? It's like this. We so often find ourselves to be content zombies, right? We're always listening to podcasts, we're always reading books, and then the question always becomes, okay, what have you put in action? The same exact scenario exists when we're thinking philosophically or trying to strategize around how we operate as men, as leaders. Okay, I understand that these are the things I want to work on. What's your game plan to go about executing on that? What are you going to start to do to actually start working on that? Like if you understand I want to be more empathetic in my interactions with my folks, how can you express that empathy the next time you have a one-on-one with somebody? Or how can you express that empathy the next time you sit down with your wife? Like
Mm-hmm.
you actually have to go out and do something about it and actually take action if you want to be able to build these characteristics and start to formulate and execute on this philosophy.
So I think that's a good bridge to, right? We talked a little bit about the strategy of it, of thinking about how to incorporate these into your lives, but what are some ways of tactically implementing these? What specific things can you do? And you spoke about empathy originally. I think from my perspective, there's probably three things that you can do to be more empathetic, at least to get started with it. One is active listening. So actively sitting down and showing that you're involved in the conversation, repeating things, asking good questions for clarity, that kind of thing. Being involved in the conversation and being present in the conversation go a long way towards being empathetic to the person. I mean, how many times have you talked to your wife and she's telling you about how bad her day is, and you're sitting there on your phone, trying to message the guys about whatever's going on there, and you've got half your mind over with her and half the mind with the guys, and neither one's really getting full concentration. And all of a sudden, her story takes a left turn, and you don't even realize what's going on. You're not actively listening to her. You're just sitting there, kind of with noise in your ear. So I think that's one way of becoming more empathetic. Another is being willing to take in different perspectives. As guys, we can become very set in our ways. We can become very, I know at least I can become very unwilling to accept other points of view. And as hard as it is, sometimes I have to shelve my thoughts, my opinions, and listen to other people with an open mind, which is a lot harder to do than it sounds. I will fully admit that. It's very hard to kind of put your thoughts, opinions, and beliefs on a shelf and listen to somebody else. And while you may not agree with them, that does go a long way towards being empathetic to the situation, because now you can at least understand where they're coming from. I suggest not getting into an argument over those things, or you're trying to sway them in a different direction, because that just leads to arguments. But understanding their point of view is huge in building a relationship with them and having that empathy built up.
It comes back to the concept of you never talk about religion, you never talk about politics, right? Like how often have you refrained from or refused to interact with somebody because they have different political beliefs than you, or they go to a different church than you do? It's not natural for me to want to talk to somebody who is considered woke, a far leftist, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not a natural thing for me. I don't necessarily look forward to having those interactions. And that's actually on me, right? Like you have to understand that if we can be in a if we could be in a perspective, if we can be a situation, that was the word I was trying to say all along, the situation where we can at least be receptive to having dialogue with somebody. We start to learn things about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not our enemy. They're not diametrically, I mean, they may be diametrically opposed to us politically, but they're still a human being. They're still a child of God. They still have beliefs and value systems and cares and interests and passions and hobbies and desires and hopes and dreams and all of these things that we all have. And if we can understand that just because they are wired a little bit differently than we are, doesn't mean that we should shun them or shut them off, right? Let's listen to what they have to say and try to meet them as they are, as another human, as another child of God. And that, to me, makes the ability to be empathetic that much easier. And one other thought, just to kind of go back to active listening really quickly. When we have conversations, such as you and I having this conversation right now, when somebody's talking, it's very easy for our minds to formulate, oh, this is the response that I want to say. And when you do that, you actually are not truly listening to what the other person has to say in this conversation. And you can miss context, you can miss the dialogue. Oftentimes they'll come across as saying, like, this guy isn't even listening to me. Rather than formulate an opinion that you want to speak to and a response that you want to speak to, actively listen, be curious. They say something, be willing to ask a question about that. Dive in, ask why. Doing those things rather than trying to listen with the intent of giving a response, that's empathy.
I'll be honest. There's been a lot of times over the course of us doing podcasts together that you've said something in the beginning of a 5-minute segment that I wanted to respond to, from the first 30 seconds, and I've forgotten everything else you've said because I've been tied up on that one thought, and it's I've gotten better at it, but that's still something I battle with. But you were talking about understanding people and having the ability to have conversations, even though you have very different opinions. I think that's pretty timely considering where we're at in the election cycle and heading into here at the end of October, beginning of November, 2024. I was just kind of chuckling to myself when you were talking about that because there's a lot of people who could use that advice and probably use a little bit of that in their lives to make them less stressed out.
Yeah.
So. The last thing from a tactical perspective that we haven't touched on is integrity, but I do think we actually touched on it fairly significantly when we were talking about integrity, right? The tactical part of it being your consistency between your words and your actions. I'm always drawn back to, do you guys do ISO 9000 for your work? It's a quality rating that you get for a company, and the basic premise of it is that you do what you say and say what you do. So you've got a quality manual and you write down everything that you're going to do and how you're going to run your business, and then you do it to those standards, and you get judged on not so much what you say you're going to do, but how you execute what you said you're going to do and the processes that you've put in place. And that's the same thing with integrity. It's basically a level of integrity. Is the company in integrity with itself? Is it defining its processes and procedures, and is it doing them as it stated it would? And that's the same with us, right? As leaders, like we say certain things. Are we following up on them? Are we doing them to the level that we said we were going to do? And then we're owning our mistakes. I don't know if you follow Sean Ryan or not, but he recently he made some comments about some things that were happening with Hurricane Helene. And I just saw this morning on Instagram, he came on and he did a huge retraction about a lot of the information that he put out was incorrect, and he had bad information, and he apologized. And I thought about that kind of going into this, that's owning mistake. I don't know that you'd ever see like mainstream media jump out ahead of it the way he did. But to be able to go in front of the world, I use that in quotes, on social media, and he's got a big following, and say, hey, I messed up. This is why I messed up. This is what I'm doing to make sure I don't do this. This doesn't happen again. And please forgive me, which is how he ended it, was pretty amazing. And to me, that builds integrity in the process. I know that in the future, I can probably trust what he says more often than not. And I know that he's going to at least get in front of it if he screws up, which to me, listen, we're human. We're all gonna screw up at certain times, but it's owning those mistakes, owning that or having that ability to come out and say, you know what? Yeah, that one's on me. I messed up. This is why. This is what I'm doing to fix it. You know, I'll do my best to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I actually think of Andy Frisella actually did something pretty similar recently too. It was around like Tyreek Hill's getting arrested prior to a
Mhm.
game, and he said something about female cops and no female should be a cop or something along those lines, right? Probably something where he spoke a little out of line. And anybody who's listened to Andy Frisella for any amount of time knows he's going to tell you exactly how he feels no matter what. He actually started one of his podcast episodes saying, "Guys, I messed up. I shouldn't have said that. That was really stupid. That was just me not being who I need to be. Like that's out of line." And the fact that he owned that, right? It's how often is it you make a mistake and you're just like, all right, we're good. I'm just gonna like pretend that never happened. Right? When you own your mistakes, it's not comfortable, but it actually shows how to truly lead. Right?
Mhm.
Coming back to exactly like you said, credibility, trust. We cannot build actual credibility if we are unwilling to admit when we screw up. And how often we screw up. How many times have I gone to my wife and said, I messed up. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And if I don't, she's very quick to call me out when I don't.
Well, Brad, I think this was a great first episode. It was really good to kind of reconnect with you, start talking about these things again. I would encourage the guys listening and the ladies to reach out to us on social media. I'm at untaming_Dan on Instagram, and Brad, you're at
Tamed_silverback.
Untamed Silverback. So reach out to us. I'd be really curious to hear stories about or examples where you've seen leadership work well and where you haven't, maybe where you've personally failed. You can reach out to us on Instagram there. There'll be posts on both our Instagrams and Fireforge Leader here shortly about this episode. So definitely hit us up. Let us know what's going on. In the meantime, I encourage you guys to follow the two of us at those Instagram handles, Untaming Dan and Untaming Silverback, as well as Fireforge Leader. And make sure you're following the podcast as well. We're really excited to be doing this section in this episode. We look forward to future episodes. So we hope to hear from you guys soon. Other than that, I'm going to leave you guys with just one thought. What are you doing to untame your masculinity?
You have just experienced the heat and pressure of the forge. Remember, words without action are meaningless. Now, after the heat of the forge, shape your thoughts, quench your brain, then put your new tools to use, adding to your leadership. Tune in next week for more lessons from the forge.